Good evening. If you got a Bible, I would recommend turning to Ephesians chapter 5. We'll pick up at the tail end of chapter 5 again, go over a little bit of what we went over a couple weeks ago, and then go right into chapter 6. They're all connected, so we have to do a little bit of review and then summarization of that before we move into this next section. While you're turning there, I will say there's a really good article in the bulletin this morning. And so if you don't have a copy of the bulletin, go pick that up. I was reading that. It's a really good reminder for me going into especially the next couple of days about where you put your trust and where you put your hope. And it's not in the things of this world, it's in God, the King of all. And so if you're worried about that in the next couple of days, go give that a read and try to settle your mind about that. Ephesians chapter 5. I don't have a fancy introduction for this one. We've reached the point where there's so much of Ephesians we've already done, we just kind of have to review all of it before we get into the new stuff. So, essentially, you started out the book with 3 chapters of the glorification of God and how amazing God is. And then Paul switches in chapter 4 and verse 1, and he starts talking about you. And he starts talking about your response to God and what is it that we should do in return for what God has done for us. He has given us a sacrifice. He has given us a place in his family. He has given us a home to live in. How ought we respond? I urge you, therefore, to walk worthy of that calling with which you have been called. I urge you to walk not as the Gentiles, to walk as children of light, to walk in wisdom. And ultimately, as you come to chapter 5 and verse 21, Paul's really the end of his request in that verse is that we all subject ourselves to each other in the fear of Christ. And it's from that verse that verses 22 through chapter 6 and verse 9 are all built. This idea of mutual subjection, this idea of mutual submission, if you will, the idea of putting aside the things you want to serve other people. If you were here a couple of weeks ago, we talked about husbands and wives from the end of chapter 5. And what we essentially decided on, or rather what I decided on, and I didn't hear any complaints about it, was the husband ought to give up the things he wants to serve his wife, and the wife ought to give up the things she wants to serve her husband. It's a mutually beneficial trade where both parties shelve their desires and do what's in the other's best interest. That's how marriage ought to work. And don't you just see that in the rest of these verses that John read for us just a minute ago? We're going to read it all in one swath here in just a second. We'll start in chapter 5 and verse 21, go all the way down through chapter 6 and verse 9. But I want you to see that really it's the same theme in all the sections. We talk about husbands and wives, we talk about parents and children, we talk about masters and slaves, and it's really the same idea. Let's start reading in chapter 5 and verse 21. Subject yourselves to one another in the fear of Christ. Now, wives, subject yourselves to your own husbands, as to the Lord. For the husband is the head of the wife, as Christ also is the head of the church, he himself being the Savior of the body. But as the church is subject to Christ, so also the wives ought to be to their husbands in everything. Now, husbands, love your wives, just as Christ also loved the church and gave himself up for her, so that he might sanctify her, having cleansed her by the washing of water with the word, so that he might present to himself the church in all her glory, having no spot or wrinkle or any such thing, but that she be holy and blameless. So husbands ought to also love their own wives as their own bodies. Now he who loves his own wife loves himself, for no one ever hated his own flesh, but nourishes and cherishes it, just as Christ also does the church, because we are parts of his body. For this reason, a man shall leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. This mystery is great, but I am speaking with reference to Christ and the church. Nevertheless, as for each of you individually, each husband is to love his own wife the same as himself, and the wife must see to it that she respects her husband. Now, children, obey your parents in the Lord, for this is right. Honor your father and mother, which is the first commandment with a promise, so that it may turn out well for you, and so that you might live long in the land. Fathers, do not provoke your children to anger, but bring them up in the nurture and the admonition of the Lord. Slaves, be obedient to those who are your masters, according to the flesh, with fear and trembling in the service of your heart, as to Christ, not by way of eye service, not as people pleasers, but as slaves of Christ, doing the will of God from the heart. With good will render your service, as to the Lord, and not to man, knowing that whatever good thing each one does, he will receive this back from the Lord, whether slave or free. And masters, do the same to them, and give up your threatening, knowing that both their master and yours is in heaven, and there is no partiality with him. Those ideas at the bookends of the chapter, different ideas. Chapter 5 and verse 21, subject yourselves to one another. Chapter 6 and verse 9, there is no partiality with God. It speaks to a very specific reality, and the reality is there are different roles that we all have to play. There are different titles that we all hold. There are different positions that we all work on this earth. And yet at the end, we will all be judged individually for the actions that we did. So are we fulfilling our roles well? What are the roles? There are several different roles here. You have several different roles even beyond these that exist. But the question is, are we fulfilling those roles well? Are we putting aside the things we want and serving the other person? Very briefly, we're going to talk about husbands and wives. I talked about this 2 weeks ago, so I don't feel the need to just run myself through that again. But the simple version is, the summary statement is, wives, you need to submit with respect. As a summary of verses 22 and 33, the idea being, hey, that's not something you always want to do. Put aside the things you want and serve your husband. That's what you agreed to. At the same rate, husbands, love with self-sacrifice. You notice that in verse 25. Love not as a feeling, but love as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her. Is that pleasant? Not really, but you agreed to it, and so you're going to do it anyway. Wives, give up the things you want. Husbands, give up the things you want and serve the other person. You notice the running theme of this section is a selfless attitude, if you will. The idea that I'm not the important one. The idea that the things I want don't really matter. The idea that I'm going to put aside my comforts and I'm going to do what's best for the other person. And you notice that picture with the husbands and wives. You notice how it's paralleled to Christ and the church. Christ gave up what he had. Christ gave up the things that he wanted in heaven. He gave up all his comforts and he came down to earth to die to serve us. In the same way, we as Christians, we put aside the things that we want in order to serve Christ. A selfless attitude on both sides. It's replicated in marriage and it's replicated in every Christian relationship. When you think about the idea of discipleship, of being a disciple of God, this might be where it starts. Selfless attitude, humility, the willingness to put aside yourself and to put aside the things that interest you, and the willingness to take up the things of God and pursue the things that make for righteousness. Selflessness on both sides. Wives, husbands, be selfless. And in the same way, let's talk about children and fathers or parents. We'll get to that conversation in just a minute. Children here are given a command to follow. So children, you need to listen to this command. And funnily enough, the one thing we have in common is that we were all at one point children, weren't we? And so I don't know where the exact cutoff is. I don't know if I'm no longer a child because I'm not in my parents' house, but I think I still owe them some amount of honor and respect, because children have been told throughout all of time, obey your parents with an honoring attitude, with a respectful attitude. In other words, give up the things that you want and serve your parents. Make things easy on them. Now, this is good and this is right. This is natural and normal. As you look at the first 3 verses of Ephesians 6, you kind of see all those points. Paul just opens, children, obey your parents in the Lord, for this is right. I shouldn't have to say anything else. It's just natural that that is something you should have to do. But rather, when we look at a child's obedience and what is expected of them, we kind of see it falling into 3 different categories. Children should obey because nature tells them to. Children should obey because the law tells them to, and children should obey because the message of the gospel tells them to. Odd points, but I'll break them down here for you. Nature tells us that children should obey their parents. After all, children came from their parents, and those who begot life have some amount of authority over it. Naturally, children should listen to your parents. Not a controversial question. Secondly, God backs that up. It's not just the natural law, it's actually his revealed law. All the way back in Exodus 19 or 20 and the 10 Commandments, you know the fifth one of those commandments? Honor your father and your mother. From the very outset of the law that God gave, one of the 10 most important commandments was show a basic honor for your parents. This was the first commandment with a promise. By the way, if you fulfill that, it turns out well for you. That's the promise of God. You may live long in the land. That's the promise of God. If you want to live long, if you want things to go well, you should pay attention to your parents. Honor them and respect them. God enshrined that from the very beginning. Nature tells you to, the law tells you to, and the gospel also tells you to. Not a point that I got myself. I was reading a commentary and it kind of pointed this out. You notice that he says, obey your parents in the Lord. Who is the Lord? It's Jesus. Who is Jesus? He is the Son of God. The Son who gave up the things he wanted to serve the will of the Father. The Son who sacrificed everything so that he could obey his Father. The very message of the gospel is about a son honoring his Father. And so, children, if you want to be like Jesus, honor your parents. There are several reasons why that obedience is required. Now, we can also argue that there are bad parents. There are parents who have abused their authority. There are parents who have mistreated their children. And yes, there are special cases. And yes, maybe if your parents tell you to go against God, you probably shouldn't do that. Yes, there are exceptions. But I can't address every exception. Like I said a couple of weeks ago, if I do that, this lesson goes on way too long. And so if you have a specific problem, maybe seek some specific help. But for now, the general rule is children, obey your parents. Now, on the flip side, you've also got a command to parents, or fathers in particular, that is discipline with peace. You notice that in these three pairings, you have wives, husbands, children's parents, slaves, and masters. In these three, you have three groups that are given authority: the husbands, the parents, and the fathers, or the husbands, parents, and masters, and three groups who are supposed to listen to the authority, namely the wives and the children and the slaves. In every case, those who are supposed to listen to authority are told to listen to authority, and in every case, the one who is given authority is told to use it with restraint. Isn't that curious? God doesn't say, fathers, lord it over your children. God doesn't say, fathers, force your children to serve you and answer your every whim. God says, fathers, be careful how you exercise that authority, because it has been given to you, but you are supposed to use it for the good of the children, not just to serve yourselves. Every time God gives authority, he gives it with a warning that you better use this properly. Because ultimately, all authority is God's, and if we misuse the things he gives, we will be judged for it. You notice that the fathers are given a negative command: do not provoke your children to wrath. The point of your authority, whether it's parents or just fathers, the point of the authority of the parent is not to inspire hatred in your child. It's not to destroy the child. It's not to break the child. It's not to make the child into a clone version of you. That's not the point of your authority. It's not to provoke wrath in your children. What is the point? Raise them in the discipline and instruction of the Lord. Nurture and admonition. Those are the words I grew up with. Those are the words I remember. New American Standard 1995, I believe. But this is the updated version, so it says discipline and instruction. What are those things? Nurture and admonition, discipline and instruction. What are those things that you're looking for? Discipline, to me, it raises the idea of turning someone away from evil. Someone does something wrong, and so you correct that, and so you jump on that, and so you say, hey, that's not the right way, and you turn them away from evil, whereas instruction is teaching them about what's good. It is not merely that you are telling them evil is bad, and then you just leave them out to dry. No, evil is bad, but here is a good path. Here is a wise way to channel those things that you are seeking. Children have many wants. The idea is not just to stifle their wants and to crush their wants and ignore what they want. The idea is to channel those things towards God. All things are good if they can be received with prayer and thanksgiving. And so take your child and teach them to discern good from evil and teach them to choose what is good. Children, obey. Your parents are trying to help you. Parents, try to help. That's your job. And so you've got those two different sides. And ultimately, what is it? It means both parents and children need to have that selfless attitude in themselves. Hey, it can't be about what the kid wants. If the kid's all about what the kid wants, then you're not going to be able to learn anything. Parents, it can't be all about what you want. If it's all about what you want, you're never going to teach your child well. It's about working together to serve the other person. May I suggest, parents, while you're thinking about this, the command for discipline and instruction, who's it on? It's on the parents. I've seen a lot of people, I've seen a lot of families, a lot of Christians take that and drop their kids off to Bible class and think that Bible class is going to discipline and instruct their child. And you know what? That might be part of it. But I know a lot of parents who have lost their children because they didn't personally take the time to discipline and instruct on their own. There's a responsibility there. You signed up for that responsibility. And so God's given it to you. He's given you that authority. Use it wisely. Discipline out what's wrong. Teach what's right. Serve your children and give them a good life, a good way ahead of them. Teach them who God is. Direct them towards Him, and He will help them. And children, pay attention. Children, listen up, because they are trying to help you. Both sides serve the other person. That's what God is expecting you to do. Husbands and wives, fathers and children, masters and slaves. Oh, that's a fun one. Masters and slaves. Will it give you any question about what we're about to say? Because I think it's exactly the same message again. Do I have to go into what slavery is? We're uncomfortable with that term, as well we should be. America has a spotty history at best. Didn't go very well for a while there. But when we're talking about Roman slavery, it's not the same thing. We're talking about Roman slavery. It was a very accepted way of life. I've seen estimates of 40% of the population were slaves. It was a common and accepted practice for them. We're talking about large percentages of the working class. We're talking about some manual labor out in the fields. We're talking about some doctors were slaves. Some accountants were slaves. Some people in the higher up of those industries would have been slaves. It's a very relative term. We're talking about employees with some lesser freedoms, shall we say. Not the best comparison, but the best one I'm able to make. And notice, Paul isn't condoning this. Paul isn't saying that slavery relationship was a good thing. But what he's saying is, hey, if you're stuck in the circumstance, you still have a responsibility. Slaves, here's your responsibility. Obey with willingness. That's not a pleasant one. Is that something a slave wants to do? Well, probably not. But what are you called to do? Put aside the things you want and serve the other person. God has given you a specific role. God has given you specific obligations. And so, to whatever extent someone else is making you work, you need to fulfill your obligations. Do you feel like you're a slave to your work? Are you employed by somebody else? Does somebody else tell you what you have to do every day? Then do that. It's your job. That's what you're responsible for. You don't get to complain. You don't get to be lazy. You don't get to slack off. No, God gave you responsibility. And so fulfill that. Slaves, be obedient to those who are your masters according to the flesh, with fear and trembling, in the sincerity of your heart, as if towards Christ. You're working towards God. He's given you all these opportunities. He's given you the ability to work. He's given you the ability to provide for yourself. You fulfill your end of the bargain and serve the other person. No, you don't always want to. And you know what? It doesn't matter. It's what you're called to do. On the flip side, not only are the slaves called to obey, not only are the workers called to obey, The ones who are in charge are called to lead, but with gentleness. Did you notice that? It's not lead forcefully. It's not enforce your will upon them. In fact, he says in verse 9, he says, do the same things to them, which is to say, serve them. Give up your threatening. That's not allowed. You can't enforce your will upon them in that way. No, be aware that both their master and yours is in heaven, and he judges without partiality. Be aware that slaves and masters, employers, employees, people who work and people who are in charge of the work, they're on the same level before God. God sees all equally, and at the end of time, God will judge all according to each one's work. Masters, you've been given a job to bless those who follow you. You don't get to force them into obedience. Your authority has been given for a blessing. Anytime we think we can use the authority that God has given to any of us in whatever role we have to put somebody else down and to destroy the other person, that is a misuse of your God-given authority. And God will call all things into account at the last day. So be careful when you use his authority that you use it properly. Slave or master, worker or the one who's in charge, employee or employer, be selfless. It doesn't matter which position you are. It doesn't matter if you're a man or a woman. It doesn't matter if you're a husband or a wife. It doesn't matter if you're a child or a parent. It doesn't matter if you're a worker or somebody who's in charge and telling other people to work. Be selfless. That's the life of a Christian. To give up the things you want and do what's best for the other person. That's the point. Walk in a manner worthy of the calling with which you have been called. What calling have you been called to? You were called to follow Christ, the one who had everything and gave up everything and came down here to serve you. If you want to be worthy of that, then you give up the things you have and you go down to serve other people. Humility, servanthood, loving your neighbor as yourself. It's all connected. It's the basics of Christianity, the very basic things we need to start to operate like Jesus did. And so, whatever roles you fulfill, we all have a variety. We all have different roles. Somewhere in your work, you're at some position in your work. Somewhere in your family, you're at some position in your family. Somewhere in the church, you're at some position in the church. They're all different types of roles. But you know what's in common with every single one? Those listed here and those that are listed elsewhere. You've been given a responsibility by God. And God's asking you to do it, to fulfill your role. It's not a complicated prospect. You know what roles you have, so go fulfill them. They look different. Husbands and wives do not act exactly the same, and yet they act towards the same goal of serving the other person. Parents and children do not act exactly the same way. Parents give responsibilities. Children should not command their parents, and yet they both work towards the same goal of helping the other person. Slaves and masters, employees, employers, it's the same thing. Fulfill the role that God has given. All the roles that God has given. All the different hats you have to wear, you do those. And you do those for the glory of God. And you do those because there's that ever persistent reminder that God shows no partiality, but he's the master of everyone at the end of the day. We have those statements that God will one day bring all things into account. God will hold us accountable for every word spoken. God will judge us individually, each one according to his work. The question is not, how can other people improve their work to benefit me? The question is, how can I improve to benefit them? That's what it means to be a servant. That's what it means to be a Christian. That's what it means to be a disciple of God, to put aside the things I want and to go out and serve. I know that I have a master in heaven who's watching the things I do. I know that I have a master in heaven who sees the good things I have done and credits them to me. I know that I have a master in heaven who sees the bad things that I've done and counts them against me. But I know that I have a master in heaven who can forgive those things and I can be free of them. I know that I have an expectation, that God has an expectation for me, that I fulfill the roles that I've been given, that I stand up to my responsibilities, that I do the work He's given. And I know that at the end of time, no matter how well other people have fulfilled their roles towards me, if I have been faithful, if I have done my part as best I can, then God will credit that to me. And I'll get to spend eternity with Him. That's the call. It doesn't matter what other people are doing. It doesn't matter the other things that are going on in your life. It doesn't matter about your external circumstances. It doesn't matter that the people at work don't like you. It doesn't matter that whatever is going on, are you doing your part for the Lord? That's what counts. Where are you serving? And what kind of role are you playing? Have you been diligent with that? Sometimes, maybe. Have you been diligent with that, consistent with that, or do you find yourself slacking? You find yourself putting on one hat and then dropping the other because you get too busy with one and you're out of balance and you're not sure where to go and you don't feel like you're living up to it. Well, that's the human predicament. And that's why God is merciful. Because He sees what we're doing and He sees how we're doing it and He takes that all into account. And He gives us a bunch of people who are here, who are all going through exactly the same things. And He tells us to encourage each other. He tells us to pray for each other. He tells us to help each other to fulfill the responsibilities He's given. If there's anything we need to do to help put you back on that right path, if there's anything we need to do to help you to balance, to help you to find what you're supposed to be doing and how you're supposed to be doing it and how you can help and how you can be a better servant in any role you fill, if there's anything we can do to encourage or to inspire you to further work, come right now. Come talk to me. I'll be right here as we all stand and sing this song.